Now, I have a Mises.org article with that title, so if you are interested in this, I would recommend that you read this. So if you just Google Robert Murphy, Wouldn't Warlords Take Over, it'll be one of the top hits. Walter Block has told me, I don't remember his exact words, but something like, this is one of the single best pieces on private military defense he's ever read. And I kind of have to agree with him. It's really, you remember the scene from A Christmas Story when little Ralphie is reading his essay over and he's like, oh, wow, that's great. That's kind of how I felt reading this. So, let me just very quickly, what are the points here? What you need to do is compare apples to apples, right? So, yes, it is possible, and we've seen historically, there can be regions where there's no state and a libertarian utopia doesn't emerge next Tuesday, right? That's clear. That happens. So no one's making the claim that anytime you have the absence of a state, all these market forces are going to kick in and everyone's just going to have these voluntary, peaceful society just pop out. But the point is usually where we see this happen is a region that used to have a government that descended into civil war. And that's why it's the mess it is now. So it's not that the people had a government and then they were all reading Rothbard and said, oh my gosh, and then their government just dissolved away. That's not what happened. They were all still statists, and they started trying to kill each other because they wanted to seize control of the government, and then no one group was strong enough, and the government fell, and now they're all fighting each other. Okay, so that is hardly an argument against anarcho-capitalism, and moreover, you could just easily cite that and say, well, that's why you can't have a government or a state, because look, sometimes it descends into civil war, right? So it's interesting that these alleged case studies in Rothbardism are actually cases of failed states. So you just say, well, that's what happens when you try to set up a government. If the balance of power shifts, it might devolve into civil war. So what the claim is that take any group of people, whatever their level of peacefulness and their ability to to compromise and to not use violence and so forth to settle disputes, and we're saying it's less likely that there's going to be warfare if you disperse the power, that you're more likely to see aggression and so forth if you give one group all the guns or most of the guns and the authority to tell everyone else what to do, and then there's this ideological background where everyone else thinks, yep, these people are in charge, and they can take as much of our money as they want, and they have a monopoly on these things, that actually is a recipe for disaster. And so, again, it doesn't matter what your view of human nature is, whether you think people are angels or whether you think they're devils. The point is having a group given a monopoly of the legitimate use of violence, that seems like a very dangerous thing in either case. So, just to follow this train of thought a little bit more, what happens is that people will say, to make the case for a limited government, they'll say, well, if you got a group of people in a state of anarchy, and they're all patronizing different competing judicial agencies or defense agencies, and people have different views initially. Like some people believe in capital punishment, some people don't. Some people think abortion's murder, some people don't think it is. Some people, think that if you violate certain religious laws, you should get your hand chopped off. Other people think that's crazy. So you got all these people in a pressure cooker, and if you just had anarchy, the way you guys are talking about, they would just be duking it out, and perhaps as a matter of prudence, you're right. Maybe the agencies wouldn't necessarily be shooting each other all the time, but there would be no rule of law. It would just be real hostile, and it would just be groups always at each other's throats, and maybe just not attacking out of prudence. But that's not the kind of world I want to live in. Instead, let's form a government where we all agree, yet we have these different viewpoints of what the just society looks like, but let's have periodic elections, and we all agree we're not going to contest it. As long as it's a fair election, we all abide by the rules, we're going to elect a government to implement these views, to try to build a consensus. And if people don't like it, they can elect somebody else the next cycle, okay? So, but we're going to not use violence to settle these disputes, and that's the role, that's why we have a limited state, and that's the argument. So what I'm going to say is, if you have a society that's capable of doing that, and for one thing, that's no state ever actually emerged in that nice, peaceful, voluntary fashion, but if it did, I'm saying that population that's so virtuous enough to be able to do that, why, when they're in a state of anarcho-capitalism, why would they be patronizing defense agencies that were shooting each other up? If you're willing to say, yeah, I realize I have fundamentally different views from you, you think abortion's fine, I think it's murder, but let's, I'm not going to physically attack you, let's vote and try to settle it at the ballot box. If you're that reasonable of a person, why then wouldn't you also say, okay, I see we have legitimate differences, so I'm not going to to pay money to a private security agency that goes and tackles you when you go into an abortion clinic, because I recognize that even though I think you're wrong, I understand you don't think that that's murder, and so I'm not going to patronize a defense agency that's just going to just be real provocative, and I can see that that's not good in the long run if we're having our agencies fight each other over this issue. Okay, so the point is, you can say, well, that's not realistic, but then why can we settle at the ballot box? So my point is just a society that can compromise and settle things peacefully, even though there's legitimate and serious disagreement on really important issues, through the ballot box. Why couldn't they do that much more effectively through the market, where there's not all the other problems that go along with government democracy? Okay, and then the last objection I'll entertain, and I'll answer a few of your questions. Wouldn't a neighboring state invade?